Today we're going to talk about creating views and workflow in DDX. Some objectives for this session are to give you some background and building blocks about how all this stuff works. What are the purpose of views? What are document types? How do they play into this process? What's the underlying database look like? Because that can be really helpful when you're starting to create a view. And what are the DDX tools involved in this whole thing? Then in our next session, we'll talk about how you actually create the view. We'll talk about preparing and organizing, getting yourself ready to go, the document types involved, how to identify logical groups of documents and piece them together. Then we'll show you how to create a new view and test that view. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about some more advanced topics like injecting SQL and setting up views for workflow. DDX exists to help you alleviate some headaches, dealing with information that's trapped and scattered all over the organization. That stuff is at risk, and DDX's mission is to help protect it and preserve it for you, and to eliminate a lot of the busy work involved in putting things away and finding things when you need them. And bottom line is to eliminate all the wasted motion, space, time, and money and make all of those headaches disappear. DDX is used in a lot of different places within any individual organization, from the accounting to sales and purchasing, engineering, and shop floor. It can be used for all sorts of different purposes. Now, when you're using it in a given area, it might help to present to the user a smaller collection of documents that are relevant to their particular job. For example, in the sales area, being able to show them a collection of sales-related documents by customer name or by order number may be very useful. Whereas if we switch our view and look at it maybe from a manufacturing perspective, we want to be able to limit the documents that those individuals can see, maybe just to drawings and work instructions, and order them in a particular fashion that makes their jobs a little bit easier. So the view in DDX really helps me focus people in on the things that are relevant to their particular job or their questions at that point in time, and to organize those documents in a way that's convenient for them. This manifests itself both in the DDX viewer and the DDX publisher. So where is the impact of a view in DDX? Really, it is in part in the DDX publisher. As you're putting away all sorts of ad hoc documents and scan documents and emails and other things, the view helps control what I can do and how I do it there. The view also impacts those people that are searching for documents and viewing them later in terms of what they can see and how it's organized. The third place of impact when it comes to views is the DDX Administrator. This is the place that we go to construct a view and control it so that it's available for people that are using the viewer and the publisher. In the DDX Administrator, you've got a bunch of different capabilities that range from maintaining divisions to document types to customizing views, workflows, setting document retention policies, and setting up security. As it relates specifically to creating views in DDX, the things that really matter to us here for our session today are document types, customizing views, and workflows. So let's take a look at the building blocks behind all of this stuff. Let's first talk about what a document type is. A document type is really one specific kind of document, like a customer invoice is a document type, or a vendor invoice, or an outbound bill of lading, or maybe it's a packet of order-related things, including the customer invoice and an acknowledgement and a bill of lading. All depends on how you want to view it, but it is from DDX's perspective, one specific kind of document. The definition of a document type contains things like the name of the document type. This is a customer invoice. An internal document type ID number. This is something that the user never sees, but it identifies this specific class or type of document to DDX so that we can present a user-friendly name to the end user. It's a customer invoice, might actually be stored as document type number 1. There's a list of keywords that are all mapped out in database fields. There are external descriptions for each keyword. So what is stored in an internal field that might be called lookup 1 could be displayed to the user as customer name. There is revision control and how revision control works for any given document type. And there are some publishing options. And all of the things that we just talked about here are all contained in the definition of a document type. One thing worth noting is that when you have defined a document type and there is no overt list of keywords defined for that document type, all of the keywords are inherited from a special document type called default. So I can create just the document type name and I don't have to overtly define each one of the keywords associated with it. But if I don't do that, I relinquish some control over what might be unique about that particular document type because we're using just a global list called default. The DDX database matters when you're creating a view, and it helps to understand a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes. Within the database itself, there's really one entry per document's virtual page. Now, a virtual page really means it's one file. So if you think of an Adobe Acrobat or a PDF file, that's one file. That could become one page. Now, within that PDF, I might have 15 different pages. I still only have one virtual page. This is normally displayed as the page number within DDX. You'll see at the bottom of the viewer screen. The visible names that you see in DDX, like the names of keywords or even the names of documents, are not necessarily the internal names. The visible names for each of the keywords are really defined when you create the document itself and you identify the keywords that are associated with it. The internal name may be something very different. We use generic fields or columns for keywords. So one field is reused for many different purposes. In one context, an internal field called lookup1 could be used for the customer name. In another context, it may be used for a vendor name. In still another context, it might be a part number. We do this because there are performance implications to adding many columns, each for a very specific and unique use. By taking the approach that we take, we improve performance by allowing you to reuse those reserved buckets over and over again for different things. There are two basic tables involved in the database that handle all documents. There's a table called main, and this is where all the keywords and the internal unique identifiers and everything else are stored. There's one of these per document. The document itself is stored in a separate table called data. The document is encrypted and compressed and stored within this table, and there is a one-to-one relationship between the main table, where all the keywords are, and the data table, where the actual document resides. If we look at the internals of the database here, we can see on the left the names of some of the typical database columns, but then across the top, various different kinds of documents are shown, and how the data, for example, for a customer invoice is mapped to use the document ID to store the invoice number, whereas in the context of a customer order acknowledgement, we store order number in exactly that same column. For a vendor PO, we store the PO number, and so on and so forth. So we can see that this one bucket, document ID, is used for a bunch of different purposes, depending on what the document type is. The same is true when you start looking at other keywords here, like lookup1. Has customer name in for some of the customer-facing documents, but it has a vendor name for other things and a part description for still others. So when looking at a collection of documents like those that are related to a customer, it's to our advantage to try and use the same internal bucket, like lookup number 4 that we see here. For the customer-oriented documents, we always store the customer order number there. It makes a very nice, handy place for us to go locate all the documents that are related to a customer order. That'll become more important as you start constructing your own new document types and as you start constructing views. The database also contains some special fields. There's a field called division that's reserved for the division codes. A division in DDX world can be either a company code, a cabinet, a department, etc. Oftentimes it is identical to the company code that you may use in your ERP system, but it's not a hard and fast requirement. This is a special field because there are security implications to it that make it easy to grant or deny access to entire groups of documents within a given division. Doc type is another field in the database that's reserved to identify a specific document as a specific type. It also has security implications because you can easily identify which document types are visible in a given view. It is always an integer, and it is always displayed to the user as text. Really, the text of the document type says customer purchase order rather than the number 2, so that the end user really never sees the internal number that's stored here. They see the text description that the system administrator has defined for this particular type of document. Page number is another special field. This represents the virtual page, i.e. the individual file, and it is always an integer as well. Doc date is a special field only in that it is always a date field or a date time field. So whatever is stored in here must be a date or a date time. Revision control has a couple of fields related to it, one called latest revision, meaning is the document in question the most current revision or not? 0 for no, 1 for yes, and this is set by the system by DDX based on the rules that you've set up. And then there's a revision date time that is used in identifying what's the most current revision. Those two fields are reserved for those purposes. And lastly, there's another field called load date. This is set by the DDX loader service to the current date and time when a new document is archived. So you can always tell when a document arrived in the archive itself. Those really are the only reserved fields, and they all reside in the main table. When you look in the main table, you see a bunch of other fields that you can use for all sorts of different purposes if you wish, and you can add new ones if you don't have enough buckets there for the keywords that you need. So those custom fields can be added at will, and DDX just picks them up and recognizes them and moves forward. It's one easy way to customize DDX to suit your unique needs. So let's answer the first question here is, what is a view? A view is a collection of similar document types. It becomes the basis for security, and it has an effect on what you can see and what you can do in the DDX viewer and in the DDX publisher. As a basis for security, the view determines what document types are visible and what document types may be published. It also can determine the rights that a user has to notes, whether they can view them, add them, change them, delete them within the document viewer. Views then, once constructed, are linked to groups for security purposes, so that all the members of a group then have access to the views that are accessible to that group. One caution on security is that security is globally enabled when the first group is created. So if you're turning on security, you do it by creating your first group. Just make sure you have a good vision of how you want those groups to lay out before you do create your first group. Otherwise, you've turned security on for everybody, and you risk locking a lot of people out if you're not careful and cautious about how you go about it. The views affect the document viewer because the user first selects a view. It makes accessible certain divisions and certain document types depending on how the view is constructed. It defines that folder structure or folder hierarchy that you see when you're looking at things through the document viewer. It determines whether or not older versions of documents are visible or not. And it can limit the scope of searches, whether it's the find option, the seek option, or any search is limited to what's accessible to you when you're looking at the system through the prism of your chosen view. A view also affects the publisher. The user first selects a view, just like in the viewer. And this limits the list of divisions at their disposal and limits what document types are publishable. So I may not be able to use the publisher to put away a certain type of document because of constraints placed on me by the view I've selected. It also limits the scope of archive-based lookups. So if you're using the drop-down lists, for example, to select your customer name within the publisher, the way the view is constructed might limit the entries on that drop-down list. So as things are defined by document type and keyword settings in the administrator, this affects both archive limited and archive unlimited lookups. So we've covered our first objective here. I wanted to give you a little bit of background and on some of the building blocks, what the purpose of a view was in DDX, review of what document types are, the underlying database, and a preview of some of the tools that we'll be using in the upcoming session here. In our next session, we'll talk about actually creating a view, how you prepare for it, how you look at document types and identify what you're going to do there, how you identify logical groups of documents. Then we'll actually create a view and test that view, and we'll get into some advanced topics like injecting SQL and setting up workflow. So that is for our next session. Go on to the next video and you'll learn more about those things then.